I didn't set out to write about anxiety and depression. When I started working on drafts of Happy Okay, they had nothing to do really with depression, and they were not even drafts of a book. I started writing poetry while I was at FIU under the guidance of Denise Duhamel and Campbell McGrath, and exploring the different ways that poetry could be used. And of course, one of them was for personal enjoyment or release. So I got into the habit of writing poetry for myself. Just instead of writing in my journal, writing about my day, I would approach my thoughts through poetry. I later became a playwright, and I produced a few plays for the Old Miami Poetry Festival and the Micro Theater, also in Miami. And I was experimenting with mixing playwriting with poetry, where all my plays were in poetry format, mostly poems à deux voix with two speakers as opposed to one. And soon I realized that a lot of my poems seem to revolve around the same characters. And I became interested in figuring out what I was trying to say about those characters. Why were they basically haunting me? I went back to some of the journal entries that I had created throughout the years, and I realized, oh, there's a theme about loss, about grief, about sadness and depression. Depression was a thorny subject for me because I do suffer from chronic depression, started in my teenage years, and of course, at first it was dismissed as just being a teenager because apparently that's what all teenagers go through. They're moody and their interests shift from one day to the next. So my mom was convinced that I was just being a typical kid, maybe moodier than others, but hey, you're a writer, so it's normal for you to feel this way. And as I grew up, when I left my teenage years behind, now it was, well, you feel this way because you're an artist, and artists get depressed, and you should carry that depression with pride because it means that you're a real artist. But after a while, it became obvious to me that there was something wrong with me, and depression doesn't have anything to do necessarily with what's going on around you. Of course, there is circumstantial depression after a loss, if you lose someone that you really care about, or life is being very tough. But I realized that there was something wrong with me, maybe physiologically or something with my brain. And it's really hard to become aware that you have a brain that basically wants to kill you, that even when everything is fine and you have so much to be happy about, that part of you is telling you that the world doesn't need you. And I came to realize while looking at my plays that I was talking about that state of mind, dealing with feelings that you cannot explain, and realizing at some point that there is something that is not quite right with the wiring of your brain. So I started focusing on exploring depression, not just from the point of view of the person dealing with the depression, but also the impact of the people who love them. How do you survive a marriage, for instance, when one of the spouses is always undergoing an internal crisis? How do you date someone with depression? How can you be a mother or a father to someone with depression, a friend? And of course, explaining a little bit more what depression is and trying to make it less taboo. The first time I wrote a piece about depression was right after the terrible earthquake in Haiti in 2010. where I had undergone a pretty overwhelming situation where I was helping some of the soldiers that were on site relay information from Haiti to the rest of the world, and from people who were in need of help, getting that information and relaying it to them. And of course, it was a state of total chaos, and everything was urgent. And I spent 3 days in never sleeping, just working straight, doing relay work. I should have been more careful because I know myself. I've been dealing with depression since I was a teenager. I was not careful enough, and I ended up having to go to the hospital because the anxiety and the depression got so bad. And maybe a year later, I wrote about the experience, and I was really surprised by how many people reach out to me to tell me their own story. You don't hear about depression growing up in a place like Haiti, where, well, if you're not feeling normal, you're probably crazy, and people don't deal with crazy. Things have changed a little since the earthquake, but when I was there, you would never admit to going to see a psychologist, let alone a psychiatrist. So it's really taboo. People just never talk about mental issues. So having people from Haitian descent come and talk to me about their own experience with mental illness, and how reading my piece about being hospitalized for depression and anxiety had been very revealing to them in terms of being more vocal about what they're experiencing, that brought some comfort. And that's when I really started thinking about writing as a way to advocate for the idea of taking specific steps for empowerment. It gave me the courage I needed to finish my memoir, which is about growing up in a very difficult place like Haiti, but also being more focused on my poetry. So I became more focused on my poetry without necessarily realizing that the same themes were coming up, right? So two things are going on at the same time. I know that I have to be more focused, but I'm not sure what I'm focusing on. Is it just mental health or empowerment? And writing those plays and going back really made me realize, I'm focusing on being a voice for mental illness. And the focus has been on this since then.